Louis Martin was born in 1823 into a military family in Bordeaux. He was the third of 5 children. As was common with military families, his father was posted in different parts of France and brought his family with him. His last posting was in Normandy, and the family lived in Alençon. I presume this is switched on. Louis Martin was born in 1823 into a military family. I mean, I don't know whether it's... Louis Martin was born in 1823 into a military family. Yeah, thanks. Did you have a visit from the police, Amanda, today? Right. You're okay. You're all very welcome, and thanks for coming this evening on such a lovely evening. I'd like, just before we start, to introduce this picture, this icon of the family of Louis and Zélie Martin. It was written in 2008, I think it was, for the beatification of the parents, and is in a little church in Milan. And we got permission to reproduce it at the time of the World Meeting of Families. And you can see there, it's on the left to right, it's Marie was the eldest girl, then Pauline, second eldest, then Louis and Zélie, and then Leonie, the third girl, Céline, and Saint Reyes with the halo around her, and then the four children who died in childhood. Helen was the girl she died at 5. We'll come back to this in a moment. And Joseph, I think he was about 2, and then there's Melanie, who was only 2 months, and another Joseph who lived for 9 months. So we're taking a little bit of a detour this evening from women saints, but to look at the parents of Saint Therese, because they are saints themselves. And I suppose I first came across them or encountered them when I read Saint Therese's autobiography, The Story of a Soul. And as time went on, I realized that to understand Therese, you really need to know a bit about her parents, because, like all of us, our spirituality comes largely from the families in which we grew up. And we find the seeds of the little way in the lives of Louis and Zélie. Louis, Saint Therese's father, was born in 1823. He was into a military family, and he was born in Bordeaux in the south of France. He was the third of 5 children, and was common, and still is common with military families. His father was posted in different places and eventually ended up in Normandy in the northwest of France, and lived in a little town, or it's a big enough town, called Alençon. Sadly, all his siblings had died by the time he was 30. When he was 20, he trained as a watchmaker, but in his heart of hearts, he wanted to be a monk. So when he was 23, he made the long journey down to the south of Switzerland to the great St. Bernard Monastery, only to be told that he needed Latin if he was to become a monk. While he was there, he did something I think was quite significant in his life. He picked a small white flower, which he kept in a book for the rest of his life. He tried to learn Latin, but he obviously wasn't gifted for languages, and so had to give up on the idea of being a monk. So he kind of resigned himself to the fact that he would live a single life and try to be as holy as he could. So he continued his training. He went to Paris and Strasbourg and became a master watchmaker, and developed a successful watchmaking business. Zélie, who was born as Zélie, Maria Zélie, in 1831, 8 years after Louis, was born in Gandelon, a village again in Normandy in the northwest of France. She was one of 3. She had an older sister, Elise, who became a visitation sister, and a younger brother, Isidore, who became a pharmacist. And Isidore married Céline, and they lived in Lisieux, and become a very significant part of the Martin story later on. Zélie's parents were very strict and showed no affection, and that was to have very serious consequences in Zélie's life. The children weren't allowed of dolls, the girls weren't allowed of dolls, which, is a strange sort of thing. You wonder what was behind that sort of thing. And the coldness that she grew up with affected Zélie, and she was worried that it would affect her relationship with her own children later. She became a very anxious, hypersensitive young woman, full of scruples and lacking in self-confidence. But she was also a devout person, and she wanted to become a nun, so she applied to the Daughters of Charity. But because she had breathing difficulties and recurrent headaches, they advised her not to. And she found that a great loss and almost a sense of rejection. So she trained as a lace maker, as Alençon was a very famous place for lace, and she started working in a factory, but she was sexually harassed so much, that she left it and set up her own small business with some local women, and that grew in time into a very successful business. And one day Louis was walking across the bridge, the Sarthe Bridge, or the River Sarthe, I should say, and Zélie was walking in the opposite direction. And Zélie had this distinct sense of these words, "This is the man I've chosen for you," but she'd never met him or anything like that, but that was to change fairly quickly, because one of the women working with Zélie was Louis's mother, Marianne, and she was so impressed with Louis that she thought he'd make a good catch for her daughter. So she introduced the two of them, and they fell madly in love, and they were married 3 months later in Alençon. And at the time of the wedding, Louis gave Zélie a medal. This medal, and there's Tobias and Sarah on the left-hand side, and then the day of their wedding over here. And when they were beatified, there was a commemorative medal got out with that same image, a gospel image. And the words of Tobias spoke to Louis. He said, "O Lord, I am not taking this sister of mine because of lust, but with sincerity. Grant that I may find mercy and grow old with her." Shortly after their wedding, Louis's mother died, and Louis's father moved in to live with them in their house in Alençon. He lived on the top floor, and he stayed there until he died in 1865. Zélie's mother died around 1867, and her father would then come to live with them. Because of, I suppose, the rigidity of the house in which Zélie grew up, she was never told, or nobody ever explained to her about marital intimacy, and she was horrified when she discovered what it was. The day before the wedding, she spoke to Louis about it and was absolutely horrified. And Louis, out of sensitivity, decided that they would live a celibate life. And in a way, they saw that as fulfilling their desire to be religious. But only about 3 or 4 months afterwards, they went to confession to a priest, and he said, "No, your vocation is to have children." And they did have children. And when Zélie had her first child, she felt such joy that she prayed she would have lots of children so that she could give them to God. And they had in all 9 children, as you saw in the picture. And all of the girls were given the name Mary, and the boys Joseph. So you'd Mary, Louise, and I've kind of put in large print there the name that they actually were known by. So Marie was the first one; she kept that name. Pauline then was the second one. Leonie, Helene was the first of the girls who she lived to be 5. Then there were 2 Josephs, Joseph Louis and Joseph Jean Baptiste, and Celine and Melanie Therese and Francoise Therese, who became known as Therese. Their house was a very happy one. The parents were very concerned to pass on their faith to their children and prayed with them every day, took them to Mass on Sundays, to benediction on Sunday afternoons. But while Louis and Zélie developed their respective businesses, they spent a lot of time with the children. They felt it was very important to spend time with them and played with them, and Louis sang for them, and a very close bond grew up among the family. And the parents also taught them to be concerned about the poor. Now, one of the downsides was they didn't mix that much with other children. And all this isn't to say that there weren't challenges and differences of opinion. There's a lovely story recounted by Zélie about Pauline one time when she was, I forget what age, 7 I think she was. She overheard the parents having a row, and she went into the room and said to her mother, "Is this what it means when people aren't getting on together?" And Zélie burst out laughing, and Louis in turn. Zélie admitted that she found it very difficult to show affection to the children because it just wasn't part of her experience, and she worried about it. And she was determined that whatever about, shows of physical affection, she would make sure they had everything in terms of toys and so on. And she went to great lengths to make sure they had nice clothes. She made a lot of the clothes herself or bought them. So their first child, Marie, was born in February 1860. She was a very independent, sensitive, and a somewhat shy girl. She would become very close to Louis. Then in September the following year, Pauline was born, and she's described as having a vivacity that called for restraint, sympathetic and lively like her mother, and she would become her mother's confidant. And one of the interesting things that many of the letters that Zélie wrote are written to Pauline. And both girls gave their parents a lot of joy. They were bright, happy girls, and they did well in school and were, by all accounts, sort of model pupils. And then that's the two, Pauline and Marie. Unfortunately, there's no image of Léonie as a child. She was very different. She was blonde and blue-eyed, unlike her brunette sisters, and she developed slowly. There are several references, and always in a, not quite a negative tone, but a worrying tone in the letters. In one letter, Zélie says, "Léonie isn't growing properly. She does not seem to want to walk. There is nothing wrong with her, but she's very weak and very small. She has just had the measles. She had them very badly with terrible convulsions." And Louis went on a walking pilgrimage to a shrine of Our Lady of Reyes, about 9 miles away, to pray for Léonie's health, and she did get better. And so when she was 1.5, she began to walk on her own. Unfortunately, she had a very bad form of eczema, which covered her whole body, and that was to be a problem right through her life. They got it controlled at times, but never fully. But it got so bad when she was a child that Zélie wrote to her sister in the Visitation Nuns and asked her to do a novena to Blessed Margaret Mary, as she was at the time. And Léonie's health improved after that novena. And Zélie attributed to Blessed Margaret Mary her healing, or such as it was at the time. And she commented she was running around like a little rabbit. But unfortunately, as I said, that condition, that eczema, was to be a problem for her right throughout her life. We today would say of Léonie that she had special needs. She had very serious emotional problems and violent outbursts, and she had learning difficulties. And so she was a source of a lot of worry to Zélie and to Louis. As I said, there's constant references to her in the letters, but always in a kind of a worrying sense. She refers to poor Léonie. I mean, she got that sort of a name, and almost she was referred to as poor Léonie constantly. But later, it turned out that there was something sinister going on. Marie caught the housekeeper beating Léonie. And it turned out that she'd been beating her for several years. She had discovered that Léonie was quite vulnerable, and she had got a kind of a sinister sort of control over her and made her do everything the opposite of what her mother wanted. And they began then to understand something of why Léonie was such a difficult child. And the maid, or the housekeeper, she was fired at first, and then Zélie had second thoughts and said maybe I should give her a second chance, so she did, but she was banned from ever talking to Léonie again. And Léonie did change for the better after that, although she had difficulties indeed throughout her life. In 1864, in October, Marie-Hélène was born, and she seems to be an exceptional infant. The intelligence and gentleness brought great joy to the parents, and to Léonie, who became her sort of playmate. And when Hélène was 6 months, Zélie wrote to Isidore, her brother, "I don't think there ever has been, or ever will be, such an adorable little girl. I can hardly believe that I have the honor of being the mother of such a delightful creature." After Hélène, Zélie had 2 boys, Joseph Louis and Joseph John Baptiste. And she had dreamt that one of the boys would become a priest. She'd even started imagining making a lace alb for him. But unfortunately, the first one died after 5 months, Joseph Louis, and the second boy died after 9 months. And that was a terrible cross for Zélie especially. And then 10 days after the death of Zélie's father died. And she was absolutely devastated. She wrote, "Yesterday I went to the cemetery. If anyone would have seen me, they would have said, "This is the most indifferent person in the world." I was on my knees at the foot of his grave, and I could not pray. A few steps farther on, I knelt at the graves of my two little angels. I showed the same apparent indifference. Never in my life have I felt such heartache. She was obviously in a state of total shock and, just beside herself with grief. Not terribly long later, they had the joy of another healthy baby, Mary Celine. But unfortunately, within a year of Celine being born, Helene died, and that was a cause of terrible grief for Louis and Zélie, and also for Leonie, because Leonie had sort of paired off with Helene, just as her two older sisters had paired off. And around this time, Louis decided to sell his business because Zélie's lace business was getting more successful, and also she was struggling more and more to keep on top of it. So he sold his business to his nephew and began to work with Zélie, which was really against the culture of the time for a man to give up his business for his wife. And it just says something about Louis's love for Zélie. Zélie was pregnant with Melanie Reyes when Helene died. Melanie was born on the 16th of August 1870. That was only 4 or 5 months after Helene died, and she died after 2 months. And that meant that Louis and Zélie had 5 bereavements in 4 years. So you can imagine the effect that must have had on them. I've heard people say that, well, it wasn't uncommon at that time for children to die, but I think that's, to kind of almost belittle the grief that Louis and Zélie felt. Certainly when you read their letters, or Zélie's letters in particular, the devastation she experienced is really, it's kind of heart-wrenching. And I suppose to their credit, they never became bitter about the losses. They continued to pray and go to Mass, believing that God would somehow bring good out of it. And then they had to face another crisis. The French army attacked the Prussia or Germany, and the Prussians reacted by invading Germany and overran France, or invading France, and overran it. And the Martins were made put up 9 Prussian soldiers and to feed them. And it was a very, very difficult time. There's an awful lot of loss of life and the inevitable economic consequences. Zélie was worried that their business would be destroyed by the war. Thankfully, they managed to keep it going and it recovered. And their sadness at the loss of Melanie was eased somewhat by the birth of Marie Françoise Thérèse, or Thérèse as she would become known. It's interesting, her sister wanted her to be known as Marie Françoise because she was of the Order of Francis de Sales. And they had a little bit of a ding-dong about it, which said she's going to be called Thérèse. But unfortunately, Thérèse was quite a frail baby, and Zélie was afraid she was going to lose her as well. And she prayed to Saint Joseph, and she says in her letter she was convinced that it was Saint Joseph kept Thérèse alive. And so Thérèse began to recover, and unfortunately, Zélie couldn't breastfeed her, and she had to send her to a wet nurse, which was common at the time. But I suppose because she was spending all her time with the wet nurse, Thérèse became more attached to the nurse than her mother. And Zélie was really upset one day when Rose, the wet nurse, brought Thérèse in, and Thérèse didn't want to be with her mother at all. She wanted to be with the wet nurse. Anyway, it turned out to be a good decision, and she began to grow into a very healthy child, and a child that certainly gave great joy. Although in one of her letters, Zélie says that she had kicked the housekeeper in the shin because she hadn't got her way, and she said she's either going to be a saint or a sinner, a great saint or a great sinner. Zélie's own health had been fragile always, as I'd mentioned at the beginning, and began to show worrying signs. And within a couple of years of the birth of Thérèse, she developed breast cancer, and unfortunately was diagnosed late and was inoperable. And the treatments that were available were very basic at the time, so she actually suffered a lot with it. So as the cancer developed, she went to Lourdes on a pilgrimage, praying for healing. It's interesting, she said, if I don't get healing, it means that God wants me to, look after my family from heaven. It's extraordinary the way she could see God's hand in things. And she died then at the age of 45 after a very, very difficult, painful illness. Reyes was only 4.5, and she immediately turned to Pauline, asking her to become her mother. Just before Zélie died, her brother Isidore encouraged, they knew she was dying, encouraged her to get Louis and the children to move to Lisieux because they'd be near Isidore and his wife and they'd be able to help them. Louis wasn't convinced partly because he was leaving so much that was dear to him, and leaving Zélie's grave, that was a really difficult thing for him, because she was buried there, and as were his own mother was buried there, and just there were so many friends and everything. Anyway, he took he took on board what Zélie wanted, and some months after she died, he moved the family to Lisieux. Isidore had looked up something like 700 houses before he found what he thought would be the best one for them. And there was this lovely house. I don't know, has anybody been in Lisieux? It's a lovely house called Les Buissonnets, and they rented that. The older girls seemed to cope reasonably okay with their mother's death and with the move to Lisieux, but Reyes just fell apart. She just, became, quite emotionally, I suppose, unstable. Pauline entered the Carmel in 1882, and that was to be a very difficult decision for Louis, because it was the first of, I suppose, many sacrifices he was going to have to make regarding his children. He thought he'd never see her again. He didn't know much about contemplative life, and it just was like a bereavement for her when Pauline entered. But because God asked it of him, he gave his permission wholeheartedly. But the combination of Zélie dying and then Pauline going into the monastery, Therese couldn't cope with it. And she became extremely sensitive and developed what we call a psychosomatic illness. She was, she almost died of it. It was shaking and headaches and mental disturbances and so on. And the family were at their wits' end. And Louis went to Paris to arrange to have masses said in a shrine of Our Lady of Victories, which was very close to the heart of Louis and Zélie. And then, while he was away, there was this experience. They had a statue of Our Lady of Victories, and Therese had this experience of Our Lady smiling at her, and she began to recover. And it developed a huge devotion to Our Lady in her. She saw Our Lady as her mother. And so she began to recover, but unfortunately, within a year or so, she developed terrible scruples. And while she had them really badly for about 18 months, and her sister Marie was a great help to her, it was something that she had for most of her life. Louis decided not to send Céline and Thérèse to boarding school as Marie and Pauline had gone, because he felt it would be too much for them, after having their sisters, or his sister gone to the Carmel and so on. But it didn't really work out. Thérèse in particular found school very difficult. She said they were the most unhappy years of her life. And during that time, Louis used to take her out to visit nature. He thought by taking her into nature, to flowers and things and the sea, that he would help her to come to terms. And he was right, he did. It developed a great love of nature in her. He used to take her fishing, which was a great pastime of his own. In 1886, a second daughter, Marie, decided that she felt called to enter the Carmelite monastery in Lisieux, and that was extremely difficult for Louis because he was very close to her. He referred to her as his diamond, and she had taken over Zélie's place looking after the family, so it was another big loss to him. Shortly before she entered, he took the family to Alençon to visit Zélie's grave and some friends. And while they were there, Leonie did one of her strange things. She ran off and joined the Portlaires. And the Portlaires accepted her without any questions. Really weird. And Louis and Zadie and the children were searching for her, and eventually discovered that she was in the Poor Clares. She lasted 2 months. And so Louis had then the whole issue of trying to make her feel she wasn't a failure. When Marie entered the Carmel, Céline took over the running of the house. And then to further break Louis's heart, Reyes felt called to become a Carmelite nun, and this was, in a sense, the last straw for him. He found it terribly difficult when she broke the news to him. He cried with her at the thought of the pain of losing her. And he did something prophetic. He went to they were sitting near a wall. He went over and pulled out a little little white flower with its roots, and gave it to her. And she wrote after it, she said, I felt that he was saying I needed to be planted somewhere else, and to be planted in the garden of God. And that little flower became the symbol of her life. We refer to her still as the little flower. She kept that in the book for the rest of her life. And Louis supported her, even though he found it terribly difficult to accept, to accept this cross that what God was asking of him. And he did everything he could to help her. He took her, first of all, to the local bishop, Monsignor Hugonin, to get his permission, because he had to get the permission. You see the way she put her hair up to make herself look older than she actually was. I had a lovely, funny story. When I was here back in the 80s, I had that picture in my room, and a painter came in one day. He said, is that an old flame? So I said, well, it is. So anyway, Monsignor Hugonin wasn't taken in by the hair up like that, and he thought she was far too young to enter. And then Louis decided to take Céline and Therese to Rome to try and get permission from the Pope. And he wasn't easily, he wasn't going to stop easily. And two very interesting things happened on that pilgrimage. When Louis was introduced as the father of 2 Carmelite nuns, Pope Leo laid his hand on his head for quite a long time. People noticed how long he left his hand on his head, more so than with other people. The pilgrims were warned not to talk to the Pope, but Therese, being Therese, she wasn't going to be stopped. And when she got to the Pope, she asked him to let her enter Carmel. And he made what she thought was he was kind of putting her off. If it's God's will, you will enter. And she was really upset. And she wouldn't move, she wouldn't go. And the guards had to drag her away, literally, eventually. But then when she thought about it, she realized that the Pope had really said what she wanted. She wanted to do God's will most of all. And she realized, what the Pope said was right, that if it was God's will, she would enter. But it was interesting that some of the priests on the pilgrimage were very impressed by Therese and Céline. And they went to the bishop and said, that young girl should be allowed to enter. She's mature enough and she's prayerful enough. And the bishop gave permission. And there's a very touching scene at the cloister door where Louis kneels down to give a blessing to Therese. Really a beautiful, beautiful thing. It was a very, very heavy cross for him. And a year after Therese entered Carmel, he had a stroke, and he was only 64. You could see the strain of everything finally, took its toll on him. He was leaving Mass one morning, and his whole left side became numb, and his speech was slurred. And it was the first attack of a condition called cerebral arteriosclerosis that would continue to develop over the next 7 years with, phases of remission and aggravation. And it would go on to attack his mental faculties, and he developed a form of dementia. In 1888, the following year, he disappeared one day and was found in Le Havre, miles away from home, totally confused, didn't know where he was. And then a few months later, that was June, and in August he had another stroke. And he was so bad that he had to be consigned to a psychiatric hospital. At that time, psychiatric hospitals were very, very primitive. There were 3,000 patients, and a lot of them much worse. And apparently the shouting and screaming that went on was very, very difficult. He was actually traumatized by the experience of even being in hospital. And the treatment was basic, and some would say actually barbaric. And he was there for 3 years in all, and it was a terrible cross for the girls in the Carmels particularly. And Leonie and Celine were so distressed by the conditions in the hospital that they took him back to Lisieux. And he had one final visit to the Carmel just after he came home. And then in June of that year, Leonie decided to try her vocation with the Visitation Sisters, and Louis died in the care of Celine and of Isidore and Celine on July the 29th, 1894. He wasn't quite 70, 71 was it? Then 3 months later, Celine, that's just him in the wheelchair. Then 3 months later, Celine entered Carmel, and that was significant for a totally different reason. She was quite artistic, and she had trained as an artist, and she was also interested in photography. And she was allowed to bring the camera with her, a very good camera seemingly, into the Carmel. And so all the photographs we have of the Reyes today are thanks to Celine. So it was the Lord worked in his own way through it. Poor Leonie had to leave again, but this time it was because the superior was so rigid, or the student, the superior and the novice mistress. And after she and several other novices left, the superior general realized there was something wrong, and decided to move the two sisters that were causing the trouble, and invited the novices back, which was a really interesting thing. So Zélie did go back and spent the rest of her life in the Visitation Monastery. And the interesting thing is, she had lots of difficulties. This is a photograph from her old age. She had lots of difficulties learning and so on, and she was a lay sister, but they say she was the one who understood Therese best and lived Therese's little way better than any of the others. And an interesting thing, I was in Lisieux several years ago, and I met the rector of the shrine, and I was taking two journalists there, and he was telling us about the family, and he said an interesting thing. He said, first of all, that sanctity is just the church recognizing the devotion of people to the saints. And he said, for that reason, Louis and Zélie are canonized, Therese is, and possibly the only will be. He said, because she's the only other one in the family that there is devotion to. I visited her grave several years ago. Thousands of people come there all the time. And it's interesting, it's mostly parents with children having difficulties that go there, and they write letters and so on asking for prayers. There's a lovely thing in the correspondence between Therese and the three Carmelites, and was that she apparently used to get a lot of hairs on her chin, and she was worried about how to remove them. So they told her about this new contraption called, thing for pulling them out, and tweezers that she hadn't heard of. So they told her about this. So anyway, she was able to get rid of the hairs. Anyway, Louis and Zélie were beatified in 2008 and canonized in 2015. That was the banner that was over St. Peter's, or in front of St. Peter's, on the day they were canonized. They were the first married couple to be canonized by the church. Helen Mongan, in her book, The Extraordinary Parents of St. Therese of Lisieux, states that the Martin spirituality can be defined in three principles: the sovereignty of God, confidence in his providence, and abandonment to his will. So I'd like just to kind of underline a few qualities of their holiness. I think the single most important thing is the ordinariness of it. That the people in Alençon and Lisieux would not have noticed anything particular about them. They went to Mass, they took the children to Mass, they attended church services, they took part in religious groups like the Vincent de Paul. Zélie had special devotion to St. Francis and was a member of the Third Order. But apart from that, nobody would have recognized anything special about them. They just lived a quiet, heroic life. They tried to do God's will in everything and to make whatever sacrifices he asked. I was very struck. I think came out in the Vatican there a few years ago that sanctity isn't about perfection. It's about loving God heroically. And I think that's a very important distinction. And you can see that they weren't perfect, but they did love God heroically. Their prayer I find very significant because the time they lived was in the aftermath of the Jansenist heresy, which was all about working for your salvation and fearing God and so on. And they had none of, they didn't have that. They saw God as friend. and Jesus as their friend. And it went very much against the thinking at the time, and that was what they taught their children. So it was something that became very important, especially in the life of Saint Reyes. We see it in her more than anywhere else. She says a lovely thing in the story of a soul. She said she found long prayers did her head in. They gave her headaches. She couldn't concentrate on the rosary. So consolation for any of us who find it difficult to concentrate. And she said a lovely thing. She said, I did what children who don't know how to read do. I say very simply to God what I want to say. And that was the pattern of her prayer. The Eucharist was central in their lives. And again, that was contrary to the tradition of the time, because at that time, people weren't allowed to receive communion very often, and yet going to Mass and receiving communion whenever possible was central to the lives and spirituality of Louis and Zélie and the children. Zélie talks about dragging herself to Mass when she wasn't well, but it was so important. They also put great emphasis on the children's preparation for First Communion. Louis attended night adoration in Alençon and introduced it in Lisieux when he went there. And Zélie saw their whole life as preparation for Mass. It is a constant preparation that goes on every day, she wrote. Third quality I would like to underline is their fortitude and suffering. They had more than their share of suffering in their lives, between the loss of children and Zélie's breast cancer and then Louis' own illness later in his life. But they faced that with great courage and heroism, really. They accepted that this was what God was asking of them and that God would work it to good for them. Zélie talked about God wanting her to mind her children from heaven rather than on earth. So as I said, there was great fortitude, and they didn't become embittered by what life dealt them. They managed to see the hand of God in it. Another very important aspect of their spirituality is their care of the poor. They didn't believe in just being members of the Vincent, and I shouldn't say just, being members of the Vincent de Paul is a marvelous thing to do on its own if one did nothing else. But they felt that wasn't enough. They had to do practical things themselves as well. And there are several incidents recorded of that. In one of them, Louis found a homeless family on the street and brought them home. And I'm sure Zélie was delighted, but anyway, she had to feed for them. And he went off and got a job for the husband and got them set up. And it's very interesting. A few months after, or when Reyes was born, they wrote a little verse thanking Louis and Zélie for their kindness. But they said something really interesting. Little bud that has just emerged, you will be a rose someday. Imagine. And then another occasion, Louis saw a beggar in a train station not getting much money. He actually took his own hat off, put some money in it, went around begging the other travellers to get some money for the beggar. Zélie often took in local people who were in difficulties and gave them money and other helps. And they encouraged their children to be good to the poor. There's a lovely story in one of the letters about Céline refusing to look after the poor, and then she went off and thought about it, and she had a kind of a conversion and came back and told her mother, I now love Jesus and the poor people. I think an important thing about them too is their balance in their family life, that they were very prayerful, but they found time to eat together, to play together, and so on. And it was very much, I suppose, against the culture of all times, because it's a very difficult thing to do, to have that kind of balance. When two of them had businesses that were thriving, it could easily have taken over their lives, but they didn't allow it to. Anyway, that's a rather long-winded introduction to Louis and Zélie. There's so much more that one could say about them, but I'll leave that to looking at the books. There's two books in particular that I found very helpful. There's this one, Helen Van, The Extraordinary Parents of Saint Reyes, and then the actual letters of Louis and Zélie. They're an extraordinary thing. They've only been published in recent years, but it's the Call to a Deeper Life. And when I got them first, I just couldn't leave them down. I was just so taken by them. Anyway, the questions will go to the last slide, please. So, what do you find attractive about the Martin family,
and what do you find challenging? Those are supposed to be the two questions. So if you want to break into the groups, we can have a little bit of time.